Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm pleased to be here this evening to present the final report on the City Entryway Beautification project for your consideration. Just provide a little bit of background on the project. As you may recall, the appearances of the city entryways have been an area of concern to the community for many years, and the council established a goal in 2013 to develop improvement plans for the beautification of public right-of-way at city entrances by 2014. The project viewed the city entryways more as continuous roadway corridors leading from the rural undeveloped areas into the downtown core. But ultimately, the purpose of the project is to examine the aesthetic conditions of the study corridors and identify actions that the city can take to positively impact the community's appearance and character. As you may recall, the project was approached in two phases. Phase one was to assess the corridors and to identify locations that would improve the aesthetic appearance of the community. That included an examination of the soft and hardscape condition, community identity creation, visitor wayfinding resources, opportunities for public art installations, locations for focal projects, and corridor enhancements as well. Phase two of the project was then to move forward into developing the concept designs for areas that were identified for improvements, and as well to develop cost estimates for those improvements. So that included the preliminary designs and cost estimating. As a reminder, there is no funding that's been currently allocated within the city budget for the construction of the improvements. The goal was to develop a plan and assess the corridors, and so that's what we're here to share with you this evening. In the fiscal 13-14 year budget, the council appropriated $35,000 in professional services for the project to assist with landscape architecture design work to support the project. And staff developed a project scope and approach, which was reviewed and approved by the council in March of 2013. At that point in time, the council authorized up to $10,000 for phase one and up to $25,000 for phase two, with each phase being authorized for approval separately by the council. Staff completed an RFQ process, a request for qualifications for design professionals to assist with the project, selected a provider with a contract that was approved by the council on August 5th of 2013. Shortly after that, we formed a steering committee to help guide and direct the project, when that steering committee held 8 meetings over the course of the project, which has now lasted almost a year and a half or so. We also conducted 2 public open house meetings and sessions over the course of the project, one which was held on September 18th and one that was held on May 29th. I just would like to recognize the members of the steering committee that dedicated their time and effort towards the project. It included Councilor Steed as chair of the steering committee, Melanie Zemmer from the University and as vice chair, Michelle Fusen from Latah County, Ken Helm from the Idaho Transportation Department, Josh Larson and Gina Trucio from the Moscow Chamber of Commerce, Iris Mays from our Arts Commission, Jim Miller from Primeland Cooperative and Paws Veterinary Clinic, Ray Pankoff from the University of Idaho, and Nels Reese from the city's Planning and Zoning Commission. A steering committee role was to provide project guidance and oversight and ultimately represent the community and project stakeholders and to provide recommendations to the City Council. There were a number of tasks that we asked the steering committee to conduct during the course of the project, the first of which was to go out and to try to view the community with new eyes. We all become accustomed to the things that we see every day, and it was important for us to have the steering committee see the community as an outside visitor would see the community. We asked the steering committee members to drive the study corridors, to record their impressions. We wanted them to be aware of transitions from rural to suburban to urban areas, to identify what they liked and what they'd like to see more of that we termed as assets, to identify areas that could be improved that we identified as opportunities, to really pay special attention to identify areas where there was a prominent visual location that could be a community focal point for improvement, which we identified as focal projects, and where there are locations where general improvements, condition of the roadways, condition of the sidewalks should be considered as corridor improvement locations, and any other items that they noted. They were given maps and photos, aerial photos of the corridor study areas. This is just one example of the south corridor. So south is here on the left-hand side of the screen, beginning at Primeland Cooperative, and then here at the south couplet. on the right-hand side. And this is just one example of the notes and areas that were noted and identified by a steering committee member. So we collected this from all the steering committee members that viewed the corridors, and then we kind of entered those into a Google map to really begin to organize the input that we received and allowed the steering committee to kind of work through and organize the individual thoughts of all the 8 members. We then moved forward into our first open house meeting, where we developed a series of stations and posters that described the project, that identified what the goals and objectives of the projects were, and to ask the community to assist us in identifying areas where they'd like to see improvements. And we had them do a very similar study with different colored dots to place on maps of each of the corridors to identify areas they liked, to identify areas they think that could be good improvement areas. And it's really difficult to see at this scale, but you have copies of those maps in your packet. But there are a number of dots that participants placed on the maps to identify where they felt improvements should occur. We developed an initial list of potential project sites with a general description and a relative magnitude of cost comparison. It was a fairly long list that the steering committee worked through to identify where they felt the efforts should be placed. And ultimately, there were 8 sites that were identified, 2 on each corridor, that came forward in their Phase 1 report recommendations as a key focal site improvement areas. So on October 21st of 2013, the steering committee presented that Phase 1 report with their recommendations. At that point in time, the council accepted the report and authorized the project to proceed to Phase 2 for the concept designs. There were some concerns that were raised through the course of the project as we got into the concept design stage with Idaho Transportation Department, and concerns about safety and clear zones. And that did delay the project for a number of months, probably about 6 to 7 months in that process to work through those concerns. And we're now have completed Phase 2 with this report to you this evening. So as I mentioned, there were 8 project sites. There were actually a number of other recommendations we'll get into, but there were 8 project sites that were identified for the concept improvement design. So I'll kind of run through those fairly quickly.
Hang on a second, Bill.
Yes, sir.
How well attended were your open house?
The first open house meeting, we had about 40 to 45 in attendance. So I think we had a really pretty good turnout at the first open house meeting. At the second open house meeting, where we were sharing the concept designs, we had probably 15 people. So it was in May, and so it was a little bit more lightly attended than the first one. But the first one, we were really soliciting the input on where the improvements needed to occur.
That was in the fall of 2019.
Was in the fall, and that one actually was very well attended.
Well, that's kind of where you wanted the most people in.
That was probably the most important stage of the project. So we'll kind of walk through these. You have each of these are included in the final report, but this is the west entry location near the intersection of Warbonnet and Pullman Road. So again, looking at that lower hill area behind the existing Walmart store, that's a fairly bare grass slope, and on the south side of the roadway with some landscape enhancements, tree installations, and it is kind of where the mall landscape buffer ends there at U-Haul. Then it becomes fairly bare from there out to the city limit boundary. So this was one of the west entry location concept design. Moving inward on the western corridor, then the next focal area on the west corridor was that Pullman and Llewellyn intersection. It's an area where Llewellyn is of limited improvement. There is a fair amount of guerrilla parking that does occur on the western side of that right-of-way at a variety of times. And so there was a desire to try to clean up that corner by establishing a screening and landscaping installation. There was a suggestion for a landscape median to begin to slow traffic as you're entering the downtown core. And this really is that transition point on the west corridor where you're going from the 4-lane or 5-lane section, higher speed limit, and transitioning into the 25-mile-an-hour more urbanized zone in the downtown core. And so this was viewed as kind of that terminal point of the western corridor where Warbonnet's where you enter, and this is kind of where you're now starting to get into downtown and identified as improvements. So a number of landscape enhancements on the roadway edge, a potential public art installation on that triangle point, as well as that landscape median. Moving to the north, the primary focus was landscape installations along the west side of the northern of the entryway on 95. This is the rodeo intersection. So beginning to establish street trees down the rodeo corridor, really have very limited tree installation up at the north end of town, and providing additional landscape buffer and screening on the west side of the highway. Coming south on the north corridor, then that corridor terminated at the north couplet. So this is at the C Street intersection with Main, where Jackson begins to swing off and continue on to the south. We have an existing slightly landscape island located at that couplet, and this would tie into the city council's goal to expand the perceived downtown area by establishing street trees up from A Street up to the C Street corridor, additional street tree installations on the west side of Main sweeping into Jackson, and additional landscape treatments in that center landscape island, the two landscape islands that exist there. Moving out to the east corridor, the steering committee felt that Mountain View and Highway 8 was really kind of that gateway, first entry point into the town on the east corridor. And so a number of street tree installations and landscape enhancements suggested and proposed in that location. And then as we continue to the west, moving in, then the next location that was identified was at the Steiner and White intersection, where there's an opportunity for landscape along the path, as well as improvements to the existing Jersey barricade, as well as the retaining wall located on the north side of the highway in that location. As we move to the south, the steering committee felt that the Palouse River Drive, really picking up from the South Fork Bridge crossing into Palouse River Drive, which is the first signalized intersection that you reach when you enter the community from the south. Again, focusing significantly on establishing street trees up that corridor, looking at opportunities for decorative metalwork, handrails on the bridge guardrails, and again, street tree installations along the intersection of Palouse River Drive and US 95 South Main. And then the last site was the south couplet, that again anchoring kind of the end of the southern corridor, and is an area where there is existing public art and landscaping on the north point of the intersection between Washington and Jackson there. But fairly limited landscaping anywhere else on the perimeter of that intersection. And again, that is the first very significant and major intersection in both anchors the Highway 8 corridor as well as 95 as it reaches into the downtown area. So that does include a number of elements of landscaping improvements, of visual gateway features along the old 95 bridge showing that view shed into the downtown core, and street tree installations. So there, as I mentioned, there were a number of recommendations that the steering committee provided to the council. The first of which was really trying to provide developing a program to encourage both the city itself as well as private business owners and property owners to really beautify Moscow, and to look at increased street tree landscaping, property maintenance, as well as targeted city efforts at weed control and removal, which was a significant comment that was received by the steering committee throughout the course of the project, was just looking at the level of weeds in the right-of-way and edge of the roadway as well as on private property. But really it was a focus of trying to create a program, trying to create some synergy among the city as well as private property owners to put a focus on the appearance of the community. The second was to review landscaping and sign clutter near the city welcome signs at the west, north, and east entrances. Some of the landscaping is fairly small scale in a pocket around the individual signs, and there was some sign clutter that was especially noted near the west entry sign, because that is the state line, so you end up having a lot of regulatory signage as you enter the state of Idaho that's in close proximity and somewhat competes for the Welcome to Moscow sign that marks the entry to the city way. Objective 3 was to design and construct targeted landscape improvements in key visual areas in each corridor, and those are the ones we just walked through. There were 2 that were identified in each of the corridors recommended for landscape improvement projects, and so those are the sites we just reviewed. And Objective 4 was to evaluate public art installation opportunities within the project corridors to add interest and character. I think we had about 4 different sites that were identified in each of the concept designs that could accommodate public art installations that were identified throughout the study. Objective 5 was to support the university's efforts to improve their gateway entrances and the historical rail corridors on the south side of the Pullman Road between Perimeter and Line Street. A number of those, 3 of those entryway gateways were actually constructed this summer, so that was certainly a very positive impact on the corridor. But there still are some other locations that the university hopes to improve the overall appearances on Pullman Road. And objective 6 was to partner with Idaho Transportation Department to pursue the potential inclusion of landscaping, public art, city welcome sign locations, and other amenities within the Thorn Creek project once that project is identified for construction. The steering committee did walk through the 8 individual sites for prioritization.